much for the invitation and for the introduction. We're always glad to get a chance to also talk about our opinions and positions and demands, and especially also in a business lecture, so I'm happy to be here. And I think I'll jump right in, and to warm up, I have directly a question for you. If you think about human rights abuses which are connected to businesses or corporations by world regions, what regions do you think are mostly concerned with this topic? Any ideas? Any guesses? Africa, yeah, pretty much. Actually, it's not the worst region where the most of the human rights abuses happen. It's Southeast Asia, but yeah, it's very close on, especially sub-Saharan Africa, and also Southern America is hit the most. Another perspective, same question by sectors. What kind of business sectors where do most of the human rights abuses happen? Any ideas? Textile, yeah, pretty good. Actually, extractive, so anything like mining is the worst one, but I think textile would be in retail and consumer products, so close enough, close enough. Yeah, thank you very much for that jump in. So I'll talk a little bit about the theory, the background on business and human rights. I'm assuming that you've heard about this in this lecture, so I won't go much into detail, but just give a little background on how Amnesty International views from a theoretical perspective the responsibility of businesses and corporations. So we have local communities that that suffer from human rights abuses from different types. It could be bad working conditions, it could be health issues that they are committed to, or environmental problems that are results from action by corporations. As we've talked, they mostly live in sub-Saharan Africa and mostly poor regions. Some of them might work in factories, in minings that are connected to big corporations, banks and associations. So the connection between those two stakeholders, these two players, is that they might depend on each other as workers or as employers. So when we look at corporations, especially those in a globalized world where corporations don't only have factories in their home country but move on to other cheap labor places, they're confronted with possible human rights violations in the host countries, which they might not actually be responsible for themselves, and also civil wars or violent conflicts. So this is quite risky to go in those areas. And because a lot of the corporations now use supplies from all over the world, use byproducts from all over the world, we as Amnesty really stress that those corporations are not only responsible for their very own area of business, but pretty much all along the supply chain, whatever supplies they're using, and that they cannot draw back from their responsibility just because it's a human rights abuse that was committed by one of their suppliers. So the central question would be if the corporations can be part of the problem, or can they also be part of the solution to reduce human rights abuses? How could they be part of the problem? Well, the most obvious one, they can actively violate human rights standards, for example, by very bad working conditions, by not providing proper protection for workers in very hazardous working environments, by employing children, etc. They could also actively assist human rights abuses, which are committed by other players, which would be, for example, within a supply chain happening, that they're actively buying products from suppliers and by this accepting that they are human rights violators. Corporations also participate in joint ventures with states that are responsible for human rights abuses. This is also quite common in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asian countries, where they're quite aware, or could be quite aware, that the states are not really protecting human rights, not necessarily in this particular business, but generally, and they accept this and still do participate in the joint venture, even though they could decide to not support this state with their economic power. A fourth being part of the problem of cooperation is that they could exploit opportunities or environments that are created by the means of human rights abuses. This is also related to happily accepting cheap prices for supplies, which can only happen or be possible because human rights have been violated, because workers are not paid, or because the environment is extremely affected and damaged, and the supplier is not paying for some remedy, for example. And the last point, which is maybe the weakest point of being part of the problem, is to maintain silence and inactivity in face of human rights abuses. Meaning that even though the corporation is aware of human rights abuses, they decide in which context whatsoever, by the host country or by suppliers, they decide to not use their economic position to change that and to help to respect human rights. But we don't have to be as negative. Corporations could also be part of the solution. They could actually foster and support human rights. For example, by including their human rights standards, by including human rights standards as a part of the guidelines and corporate principles. They could have human rights standards as part of due diligence and internal monitoring. And they can make their employees commit to human rights standards. Today, a lot of firms, but public institutions, you have, as an employee, you have to commit to the data protection laws. You could also do that for human rights, right? So this is something possible to do. They can show back practices in cooperation and within this supply chain. And of course, they can also use their position within the civil society, within an economy, to actively commit to human rights on a political level, and also actively engage against human rights abuses in the host country, to actually use the power they have to put pressure on governments of their host countries. This is something, the levels of co-responsibility, probably part of your lecture, so I go through it quite fast. So, of course, corporations want and should make profits. They have the legal obligation to obey national laws, both in their own countries and in their host country. Whenever a sector gives themselves codes, they can implement higher standards in their own area of business. And lastly, the corporate social responsibility, they can take responsibility for the consequences of the actions of the company. But what we also want to stress as an NGO is that despite Amnesty International really takes corporations into responsibility, we always stress that corporations cannot take on the state's responsibility in international human rights protection. It's always the states that have to protect human rights. And corporations can play their part in their areas of business, of course, and they should, but ultimately it's the states that are responsible to protect human rights. And that's how we move on to the next player in this little graph, so the governments. They are, of course, also connected to corporations, for example, by joint ventures, but by also monitoring their work in the host country, making sure that they actually obey the laws, obey labor standards that exist in this country. And of course, they have the responsibility towards the local communities to protect those human rights. So, as I've already said, governments carry the primary responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. This is the trinity of state duties in respect to human rights. They may not withdraw from their responsibility for human rights just by referring to the economic power of corporations. They can't say, well, oh, this is such a big corporation, such a big company, we cannot make them respect human rights because this endangers our economy. Governments do that, but they shouldn't. The governments carry also the obligation to prevent human rights abuses by private players, for example, by monitoring, by carrying out checks on business sites, for example, by making sure that labor standards are met. And eventually, if some human rights abuses have happened, the government has to guarantee that there is access to justice for victims of human rights abuses, and they should prosecute crimes by corporations. So, as a next player, we have intergovernmental institutions and organizations. In this framework, it's mostly the OECD and the United Nations that have established guidelines in this context. And especially if we're talking about global economies, it's quite important to use these international organizations to put up guidelines that are relevant for all the corporations across all countries, and not only having national laws or national standards. And the basis of Amnesty International's work, but also the basis why we argue that corporations also have a responsibility towards human rights, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations. And it says in the preamble, it says, every organ of society shall strive to teach and educate and to promote respect for those rights and freedoms. So this is the basis also for the United Nations to put up guidelines for businesses and human rights. And one guideline that Amnesty has welcomed, because it is basically the strictest and most effective one that has been in place so far, is the UN Guiding Principles of Businesses and Human Rights. And it basically sets out the responsibility of companies to respect international human rights in their global operations and their supply chains, and it requires them to carry out human rights diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address human rights. This was adopted by the UN Commission of Human Rights, and it also includes the demand for national action plans of individual governments. There's also one in Germany, which actually from a perspective of Amnesty International is quite weak, because it completely relies on voluntary actions by the businesses. What is human rights due diligence? We as Amnesty International, and based on these guidelines by the UN, see that it would be transparency measures in non-financial reporting concerning human rights all down along the supply chain, an assessment of human rights risks. What do we mean by that? We mean that corporations need to assess if they put up a business or operation in a certain country, are there any situations in place that makes it risky for human rights to be violated. For example, a country that is known to violate human rights, or wage systems that are likely to be so low that the individuals won't be able to support their living, or very hazardous mining, or etc. That would be clear that it is risky that human rights can happen. They should also make an assessment of the effects of business on human rights, on their business, yeah, make an assumption what could happen. They can certify in the certifications in the supply chain, like fair trade certifications. Oops, I'm sorry. Human rights due diligence also means stakeholder dialogue, including people involved, not only the shareholder value, but also including people involved and affected by those business operations in the decision how to operate. And finally, to install complaint mechanisms for workers of suppliers to be able, to complain about what is going on with the supplier. So this is enough on the theory part, and then I would now like to move on to examples from Amnesty International's research. I've called it field study because they are so thoroughly that you probably would qualify for some academic work as well. I've picked 2 examples that I hope are interesting for you and have been the most recent ones, the most recent big reports by Amnesty International. So the first one is on palm oil, the great palm oil scandal, labor abuses behind big brands. Why would we care about palm oil? Palm oil and palm-based ingredients are found in roughly 50% of common consumer products, so very likely most of us in this room has either eaten or used something that contains palm oil today. And because of this, the global production has doubled over the last decade and is estimated to be doubled again by 2020. The largest producer of palm oil is Indonesia, and because it already for a long time has been in the critique, the production of palm oil, there is a roundtable on sustainable palm oil, which certifies palm oil and consumer products as sustainable, which is supposed to mean that those that the palm oil is produced without exploitation of workers, without deforestation, and without environmental and social harm. Amnesty has concentrated its report on Wilmar. It's the world's largest processor and merchandiser of palm oil, and it's controlling over 43% of the global palm oil trade. How could human rights abuses happen in the palm oil production? What you see here is a harvester of a palm tree where he cuts off these big bundles of palm fruits from the tree. As you can guess, this is quite hard labor, which by itself, of course, is not a human rights violation. But if it's not paid accordingly, it can be. In this case, we have human rights abuses through bad working conditions. They have a system in place for wages that is both based on time worked and output per worker, and it includes quite high penalties if the daily target is not met, which results for the workers to be most of the time not even earn the minimum wage, which you can guess isn't very high in Indonesia anyways, right? So, which results in them working extreme hours. Amnesty International has interviewed workers who said that they work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week to meet the targets. And makes it difficult for them to earn their living. And it also includes so-called forced labor, which is defined in the human rights standards as work which includes threats to lose the work and wage deductions that are very arbitrary for casual day workers. So not all of the workers, all the harvesters are day workers, but a lot of them are. And they are constantly threatened if they don't meet their target that they will lose their job the next day. So this classifies by human rights standards as forced labor. The next human rights abuses in the palm oil production, you might not be able to see that, but that's a child. working on a plantation and transporting those palm fruits over this bridge. The problem is that due to this very complex wage system, harvesters can't meet their target, and one solution is working extreme hours, which all of them do, but even if that's not possible or that is not enough, they include their children in the work and make them help them. For example, by collecting fallen palm fruits and by transporting, etc. Vilmar, the processor of the palm oil, is aware of the child labor there. They basically, they don't accept their responsibility or the causation through this wage system for the child labor. They basically put all the responsibility to the parents. Well, child labor isn't allowed in Indonesia, we don't want child labor. Well, it's the parents who shouldn't bring their kids. And this, from Amnesty International perspective, is way too easy to pull out of this responsibility. Then there's another factor. This is a woman collecting these palm fruits that have been fallen down, and this is another woman spraying herbicides and pesticides on the plantation. You might guess already, this doesn't look like the perfect protection in terms of health. And you might know that herbicides and pesticides are basically poison. So, and this is pretty much the issue here. We have big abuses of the right to health, extremely unhealthy working condition due to the use of pesticides and herbicides with a lack of even basic protection concerning the hands, the mouth and nose and everything. Also in this case, the employers are quite aware how dangerous the job is. They regularly take blood samples of their employees, but that when these blood results are too bad, it usually results in this mostly women being fired and not being able to work anymore, and they're not informed about the results of their blood tests. They just that no, I can't work here anymore. So this is certainly not a responsible way of handling this human rights abuse. And additionally, we have gender discrimination in terms of that women are only set to certain tasks on the plantation, and women are in principle only hired as casual daily workers, which denies them any social responsibility, social security benefits that are in place, at least for some of the permanent workers there. So how are corporations responsible in this respect? I've said already 50% of consumer products include palm oil. Any guesses what kind of corporations have been involved in this issue? Which corporations were connected by Amnesty International to these plantations? This is the 9 corporations that Amnesty International connected to those palm oil plantations. As was mentioned before, Nestle, that you've heard a couple of weeks ago, also connected, and basically all big corporations that produce consumer products. Procter & Gamble, Unilever was mentioned. They all, Amnesty researched that they're all connected to this supplier. And actually most of those firms are member of the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil that I mentioned earlier. So they claim the use of sustainable palm oil. From what you've heard before, what Amnesty has researched as human rights abuses, this roundtable is really no proof of a compliance with human rights, workers' human rights. We see the responsibility for those corporations to ensure that their supply chain is free from abuses such as child labor and forced labor. These are really severe human rights violations. This is not just some labor protection that's not perfectly met. You know, that's very severe, and we could expect from corporations of that size to be able to ensure that. Actually all of those companies have some information on their due diligence processes, but none of them can provide any explanations why they were not able to detect those abuses, which would be the idea of a due diligence in this case. So apparently the due diligence was so inefficient, even though this is common knowledge that palm oil industry is high risk for human rights abuses. And in this context, I would like to mention Amnesty International is a big NGO, yes, but we're still financed through donations and membership fees. We are not a million trillion worth of corporations. So if Amnesty International was able to detect those connections, you would guess that Nestle or Unilever would be able to finance research to find that out themselves. So apparently there is missing willingness to do so. And Amnesty, of course, in researching this, has the correspondence with those corporations, and they gave them a list of consumer products by the firms and asked them which of them included palm oil from this Wilmar production. And basically, I think one corporation agreed, yes, our bar soap includes palm oil from these sources, but all the others claim, and Kellogg's, I think Kellogg's said that the Pringles that is sold in China includes this palm oil, but all the others claimed that none of those products contain palm oil, or they just didn't respond at all. So they really lack transparency in terms of which products in detail are connected to those operations by Wilmar. As I mentioned earlier, corporations are responsible, yes, but the governments are as well. In this case of Indonesia, actually, Indonesia has quite strong legal frameworks on labor work in place. They do exist, but they completely fail in adequately monitor and enforce those laws and to prevent and remedy those abuses. And it's by this violating its obligation to protect these people from human rights abuses. So concluding, in connection with palm oil, Amnesty International finds bad working conditions, exploitation of children, gender discrimination, and violations of the right to health. Moving on to the next topic, this is the cover of an older report from 2013. So Amnesty International has for a while been working on mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and has some more recent reports from 2016 where Amnesty International went to these mines in southern Democratic Republic of Congo and looked into the mining of cobalt. There was a follow-up report in 2017 which looked into the actions or inactions of corporations that are involved in those cobalt supply chain and what has happened in between. So I will get into this a little bit. Cobalt, why do we care? It's a key component of lithium-ion rechargeable batteries, and as you might guess, this has become increasingly important, both through tablets, computers, and cell phones, but also increasingly for the car industry for electromobility. More than 50% of the world's total supply comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I will abbreviate by DRC now, and 20% exported from the DRC comes from artisanal miners. These are very small mines. I will explain a little more what this means. So there are 110 to 150,000 mines in southern DRC. I suspect this is a little small. So this is a supply chain. So we have these artisanal mines, they sell their ore to intermediates, especially children will do that, or to licensed buying houses in the region, and then it's smelted either in Congo or moved, exported to China, to HUAYOU COBALT, which is the major smelter that Amnesty International has looked into, and then it's moved on downstream to the lithium-ion battery component manufacturers, the lithium-ion battery manufacturers, and finally to the consumer products in electronics and car companies. On a world scale, we find this here. The DRC is located here, goes to China first, and then moves on to other Asian countries, and later on the consumer part to the United States and Europe. What is artisanal mining? These are miners that basically mine by hand using very basic tools. A lot of them do that basically in their kitchen. There's a video by Amnesty International on YouTube where they show that basically some people would dig up their kitchen and go in the earth to mine cobalt. Artisanal mining includes children as young as 7. They usually don't do the mining itself, but they collect ore that are byproducts from industrial mining, or they clean and wash up the ore before they sell it off. Those very small mines were driven out out of many mining sites that have been made available for major Western and Chinese companies. And they're now working in unauthorized, unregulated areas, or they're passing on land controlled by industrial mines, which also means that in terms of working conditions, in terms of safety measures, it's unregulated, it's unauthorized. Work arrangements differ quite a bit. There are some that are self-employed, as I said, digging up their kitchen, or that are hired by workers. And these are pictures from one of a couple of mines. I cannot see if you can see that, but yeah, it's underground basically. What kind of human rights abuses do we find connected to artisanal combat mining? As you can guess, abuses to the right of health. Those miners are chronically exposed to dust containing cobalt, which is highly poisoned, without most basic protective equipment. It's a very physically demanding type of work, especially for women and children that are also included. They carry on big sacks or bags of ore, and are also exposed to this very hazardous environment. And also, as you can guess, just digging up in the earth is not very safe. Within a year, there are 80 reported fatal accidents in mines. And as you can guess, this is just a small part of the true accidents that are very likely. A lot of cases, people are just left in the mines when they died, and the death is not reported. As I've already mentioned, also in this case, child labor is happening. UNICEF estimates 40,000 children working in mines across southern DRC in a very dangerous environment, very likely to be exploited. They would bring those collected ores to the selling points where they get a price based on the weight of the ore they have collected. As they don't have weights themselves, you can guess it's not very likely that they get the adequate the sums that they would be justified for what they've collected. Amnesty, as I said before, there are basically 2 reports. So there was the report in 2016, and then later on, Amnesty checked what has happened in between. So the most responsible smelter, the HUAYOU COBALT, actually has taken some action. Since the report of Amnesty International, it has conducted a detailed supply chain mapping and risk identification process in the DRC. It has also introduced a strategy for responsible mining and focusing with a focus of child labor. And it has been relatively transparent about their due diligence. So this is some progress. But however, it's not perfect yet. So there is still the responsibility to remedy human rights harms associated with past sourcing practices. And there has also been a lack of disclosure of the details of the suppliers, the trading locations, and the very specific findings of what they found. And while, of course, child labor is the most severe human rights abuse, and it's important to stress that, they have not really extended their progress on addressing the health issues that are someplace, or at least we don't know anything about that. So we would say they're moving in the right direction, but there's still significant scope for improvement. So this is still on the earlier part of the supply chain. What's going on with the downstream companies that are also, as I said earlier, responsible for the human rights abuses that happen. Generally, you can say they pretty much fail to meet international due diligence standards. Along the supply chains, they hardly conduct adequate human rights diligence despite the guiding principles that are in place, despite the fact that it's known for quite some time that there's child labor happening, that there are serious working conditions. So they do have some due diligence sometimes, but these downstream companies don't provide really details on their specific investigations and checks how they would plan to address, for example, child labor. And they also still fail to publicly disclose the smelters and the due diligence practices they have been following. In this new report of Amnesty International from 2017, Amnesty has tried to assess the performance of those downstream companies in respect to human rights due diligence, and has posed basically these 5 questions and assessed how well they are doing. So the first question is, had the company investigated its supply links to the DRC and the smelter who is especially responsible? Does the company have robust policies and systems in place to detecting human rights risks and abuses in its cobalt supply chain? So here again, the example, they could guess that if you're not working with industrial mining, that this is a very unsafe working environment, and this is a risk that they should look at. Has the company taken action to identify choke points and associate human rights risk and abuses? Has the company disclosed information about human rights risk and abuses in its cobalt supply chain? And finally, if the company has taken steps to mitigate human rights risk and remediate harms related to its cobalt supply chain. This is all based on these human rights, United Nations guidelines. And Amnesty has basically 4 levels: no action, minimal action, moderate action, and adequate action. And I will show you charts how well they are doing. It's probably too small to read in detail, but that's fine. It's more of the principal concept. So here are the 5 questions, and that's how these companies are doing. And we have along the supply chains, we have here the cathode materials manufacturers, so the very first step for the batteries. Then we have the battery cell manufacturers. Then we have the computer communications, consumer electronics companies. And finally here, the electronic vehicle manufacturers. Going back, you'll see here is the aggregated rating based on these 5 questions. And you can see most of them are not doing very well, right? So most of these batteries are not loaded up. Samsung battery manufacturer is doing pretty well, LG, Chem as well. But that's about it. On the computer, communication, and consumer electronics part, Apple, Dell, and HP are doing okay, but everyone else really not so much. And on the car production side, BMW and Tesla are doing okay, but everyone else does pretty poorly. And as I said, this is all based on information Amnesty was able to collect. So these companies could too. But again, not only the corporations are responsible, but also the government of the DRC. And here we find big gaps and weaknesses in the government's regulation on this artisanal mining. Additionally, they don't really have any capacity to actually monitor and enforce safeguards that are in place. I think the responsible ministry has like 20 agents to actually visit the sites. They have started a process of a national action plan to eliminate child labor, but it's still not adopted, even though they have been trying to do that since, I think, 5 years or so. And the governmental agencies that regulate this artisanal mining only operate in authorized mining areas. As I said earlier, there are way too few of them, so most of the mining is happening outside those authorized areas, and so there is no regulation and control whatsoever. And there have been cases of state officials that actually have been to these artisanal minings where they basically were very corrupt and asked the miners for payments, illegal payments, so they're not doing their job anyway, neither. And in terms of child labor, the DRC is failing to actually provide really free and compulsory primary education, which leads often cases for the children to go to work because the parents can't afford the school education. So summing up this part too, we have very bad working conditions and exploitations of children. Finally, there's one player left, NGOs. And civil society, generally consumers. They often are they come from local communities, but not necessarily. They can also be other NGOs that are not directly connected to the communities. They can be connected to the intergovernmental organizations, for example, by being consultant, have a consultant status with the United Nations. They can demand governments to protect human rights, and of course also corporations. And as an example, I would very quickly also tell you a little bit about Amnesty International. Hopefully you know all of this, but in case you don't, I'll go through that really quickly. So Amnesty International is a global human rights movement which was founded in 1961 by the British lawyer Peter Benison by publishing this newspaper article, The Forgotten Prisoners. We are a global movement with more than 7 million members, which work in 150 countries. In Germany, we have more than 150,000 members and supporters, which are organized in 650 local groups. We are a voluntary commitment on the basis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I myself are a volunteer, so I'm not a staff member or anything. And we are a joint commitment of people of different ages, nationalities, and backgrounds for the human rights. And we are a human rights movement that is independent of any government, any political ideology, economic interest, or religion, and we are funded mainly through our membership fees and public donations. How does change happen? How do we work for or on human rights? The big part that the results you've seen is research. So it's important to start with facts. We have experts who do accurate and cross-checked research into human rights violations by governments and other players worldwide. How does this research happen? If we look at this corporate responsibility in human rights, the case I've showed you before, So Amnesty International has actually gone to those places. They have visited plantations, they have visited mining sites, and interviewing workers there. In both cases, it's roughly 100 people they've interviewed. Additionally, they interview activists and staff of NGOs that are working on these topics. They meet with government officials. That's pretty important for us because we always want to give the governments also the opportunity to pose their case, to say what their view on these issues are. And then basically they've using, especially in this supply chain area, they use export data, public records, including investors' documents that have been published by the companies to trace these international supply chains. And in both of those cases, then there was a correspondence with the companies to ask them questions and give them the chance to respond. Those responses are also always published in the reports. If we've done the research, what happens next? We use advocacy and lobbying. We use this analysis of the facts we have gathered to influence and press on governments, companies, and decision makers to do the right thing. So concluding from what you've heard before, what are our demands, what is left to do? So we demand that there is no impunity for corporations. It's necessary to close the accountability gap. There needs to be access to remedy and justice for all people whose rights have been violated by corporations. And it's also important to actively include the people in the decision making when it concerns their life, when it concerns their environment and livelihood. There need to be national and international binding regulations for corporate players. The voluntariness that has been in practice for many years now is not really working. And governments and intergovernmental organizations have to effectively track and review implementation of those regulations. So yes, we have the research, we have the advocacy and lobbying, and we have campaigns and actions. So we have petitions, we have letters, we have protests, we have campaigns worldwide to press, additionally to the lobbying for those people and to support those cases. So what is left to do for you in this case? We've brought the petition addressing the case of COBALT, and we have a petition addressed to Microsoft CEO, where we demand basically what I've said before, that they really disclose whether human rights are respected along the global supply chain, which steps Microsoft has planning to take if human rights abuses have happened, and that they really need to carry out human rights due diligence, and finally show what kind of measures they have taken to make sure that child labor is ended. So this is it. If you like Amnesty, please join or donate. We always need money to make this research. This is expensive, as you might guess. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss what we've said.